Chapter 10, Harvest Time. The only reason I was hopeful about returning to school was that my father had managed to harvest a small plot of tobacco. He had saved the seeds from the previous year, and back in September, I'd nursed the seedlings down at the dambo before transferring them to our fields. Somehow the plants had survived much of the famine and grown fairly healthy, the leaves light brown in color with traces of red. Several weeks earlier, Jeffrey and I had picked the tobacco and hung it to dry under the bamboo shelters. In a normal year, a crop that strong would fetch a high price at the auction in Lilongwe. But now, with the hunger, we couldn't be sure of anything. Besides, my father had already started borrowing money and maize in exchange for the tobacco once it was ready, which meant that the minute those leaves were dry, we'd have to start settling our debts. As the first day of school approached, I was getting indications that things were okay. For one, my father had said nothing to me about staying home due to lack of fees. In fact, one afternoon he even handed me a few kwacha to go buy a notebook and pencils. And my mother had purchased a big bar of Malua soap, which allowed me to finally scrub the yellow stains from my school shirt. The night before the big day, I carefully ironed my clothes and laid them on a chair right next to my school supplies so they were ready for the morning. I was so nervous that I stayed awake for hours trying to imagine every detail. What I would eat for breakfast, what I'd look like in my uniform, and how I'd greet Gilbert on the road. I desperately missed my friends and the excitement of a classroom. I know the feeling. When Gilbert appeared from the trees the next morning, I ran to meet him. "Gilbert! Bo! Bo! Sharp! Sharp! Fit! Fit! Welcome back, friend. It's good to walk with you again." "Oh, thank you, Gilbert. It's good to be here." It was great to be back with my pals, all the jokesters and usual entertainers. I saw many familiar faces. We were all still thin, and that wouldn't change until the harvest, but at least our health was improving. But just as I'd feared, I was behind in everything: geography, agriculture, math, all the subjects I'd studied in the library. My fellow students were working on graphs and variables and scientific names of animals. I didn't know any of that stuff. I struggled for the first 2 weeks, copying all the notes I could while trying to get the hang of classes once again. It had been a long time, and so much had happened. Excuse me. Josie, shush! There's some critter under the shed, and Josie keeps barking at it. Sorry. After 10 days, the deadline for paying school fees was approaching, and I started getting nervous. Something didn't seem right. My father knew my fees were due, but he hadn't mentioned anything. And fearing the worst, I couldn't bear to bring it up. The closest we got was a short conversation one afternoon in the fields. "So, how is school life?" he asked. "It's going okay, but I'm so behind. I think with time I'll catch up." "Well," he said, "just work hard." Despite him saying that, I couldn't help the sick feeling in my stomach. It was still there the morning Mr. Feary gathered everyone for morning assembly. "Fees for this term are due Monday," he said. "And those students who didn't pay last term's fees must also pay those without delay." Hey, wait a minute, I thought. Even though I'd dropped last term, I still had to pay those fees? It didn't seem fair. Together, the 2 terms equaled over 2,000 kwacha, Given what my family had just been through, 2,000 kwacha was an impossible amount. I knew my fate was sealed. But instead of going home to face it directly, I tried going to school for free. I snuck in. I had to calculate my movements carefully. On Mondays and Fridays, Mr. Feary held assembly inside the same classroom. There, he read aloud all the names of the students who had already paid their fees, telling them, "Go to class straight away." The students who were still seated had to show a receipt or else stand up and leave. Jeffrey had been humiliated this way 2 years before, so I was ready. On the first day of roll call, I arrived at school with Gilbert, as usual. But as soon as everyone went inside for assembly, I ducked into the toilets to hide. I stayed low and scanned the courtyard. I stayed low and scanned the courtyard through the tiny window. The minute Mr. Feary released everyone, I slipped into the crowd unnoticed. In class, I sat in the back of the room and kept my head down. I never asked questions for fear of being noticed. As long as I was silent, I thought, I could listen and still learn. I was certain Mr. Tembo was wise to my tricks, remembering that I was booted the previous term for lack of fees. But if he knew, he never called me out. The whole experience was so stressful that each morning I awoke with the same awful stomach ache. Gilbert would meet me on the road and try to make me feel better. "Good morning, friend. I'm happy to see you're trying your luck again." "Yeah," I said. "Let's hope today isn't the end." "Just stay quiet and don't say anything." "I guess." Finally, after 2 weeks, I was busted. One morning, Mr. Tembo read aloud the names of debtors in the class, and that's when I was caught. The second my name was called, I stood up and walked to the door. "Guys, I paid," I said, trying to be cool. "I just forgot my receipt. I'll get it and come right back." Once outside, I began to cry. Then I went home and told my father the news. "I've been expecting this," he said. "I just didn't know when." But instead of breaking my heart, my father went to see Mr. Tembo and pleaded on my behalf. The tobacco would be ready in a few weeks, and after paying his creditors, my father was hoping against hope there'd be enough left to sell and cover my school. "I'll have the money soon," he said. "Just please let him stay." Mr. Tembo spoke to some other teachers. They agreed to let me stay in school for 3 more weeks, long enough for my father to sell the tobacco. And those 3 weeks were fantastic, like winning the jackpot. No more sneaking around, no more butterflies in my stomach. Now I could relax, learn, and participate in class. And when the teacher cracked a joke, I laughed at the top of my voice. Just like you guys laugh at my jokes. "Oh, that's so funny!" Or, "Good point, I didn't know that." The other students gave me strange looks. "These past weeks, he's been posing as the cool, quiet guy," one said. "But look at him now." At the end of 3 weeks, the tobacco was finally dried and ready, having turned a light chocolate brown in the sun. Once this happened, the creditors began turning up at our house, looking to be paid. "I've come for my 50 kilos, one said. "Given our earlier agreement, do you have my 20 kilos? Asked another. By the time the last trader left, pushing a bicycle laden with our tobacco, all that remained was a 60-kilogram bushel. My father loaded it into a pickup and drove it to Auction Holdings Limited in Lilongwe, where the buyers only agreed to take 50 kilograms. After transport costs and government taxes, my father came home with around 2,000 kwacha. It was just enough to pay for my school, but then there'd be nothing left for the rest of the family. No money for my sister's shoes, no cooking oil, soap, or medicine if someone got sick. Once again, we were broke. My father tried negotiating again with Mr. Tembo, but Mr. Fury forbade me to return. He said that his boss, the Minister of Education, was visiting various schools to ensure that the students were paying their fees. If we're caught, we could lose our jobs, said Mr. Tembo. I was sitting in the courtyard when my father returned with the news. I've done my best, he said, but the famine took everything. He kneeled down to face me. Please understand me, son. Pepani kwa mbiri. I'm very sorry. Your father tried. It was too difficult to look at him. Jabuino, I said. I understand. At least with daughters, a Malawian father can hope they'll marry a husband who can provide a home and food and help them continue their schooling. But with a boy, it was different. My education meant everything to my father. That night, he told my mother he'd failed his only son. Today I let down my entire family, he said. I couldn't blame my father for the famine or our troubles, but for the next week I still couldn't face him. Whenever I did, I saw the rest of my life. My greatest fear was coming true. I would end up just like him, another poor Malawian farmer digging the soil, thin and dirty, with hands as rough as timber and feet that knew no shoes. My life would forever be controlled by rain and the price of fertilizer and seeds, never by me. I would grow maize, and if I was lucky, maybe a little tobacco. And years when the crops were good and there was a little extra to sell, perhaps I could buy a new set of clothes. But most of the time, there would be hardly enough to eat. My future had been chosen, and thinking about it scared me so badly I wanted to be sick. But what could I do? Nothing, only accept. I had no time to feel sorry for myself. The maize was finally ready in the fields, and my father needed all of our help. As much as I'd waited for this time to come, I entered the harvest with a conflicted heart. Now that I knew I wasn't going to school, the maize rows appeared like the bars of my own prison. I would enter their shadows, and the gates would lock behind me. Wow, that's a very interesting simile. It's a simile because he uses like. The maize rows are like a prison. That's deep. But at the same time, my God, we were finally harvesting our food. And really, the harvest was the most fun time of the year, even better than Christmas. It was a time to celebrate all of your hard work. All the mornings you woke up at 4 a.m. to dig ridges and pull weeds. But this season, it was even more significant. A time to remember the famine, the many nights of hunger, and the good people across Malawi who didn't survive. Mostly, I thought about Kamba and the sadness I carried inside. And now as we entered the maize rows, ready to work, it was as if God was rewarding us for our sacrifice. We had a beautiful crop. The best in years, my father said. Just look at it. My mother stood beside him, staring across the fields with a smile I hadn't seen in months. We made it after all, she said. For the next 2 weeks, we harvested all day, with satisfied minds, and at night we slept like lions with bellies full of food. After collecting the cobs and hauling them home by ox cart, we spent 3 glorious weeks just sitting in the courtyard plucking what we'd grown. We listened to the radio, sang songs, talked about the weather. Life had returned to normal. In storage, our grain sacks were full once again. So many they reached the ceiling and spilled out the doorway. Some soybeans from the garden were also ready, which meant we could enjoy regular meals. Slowly, all the weight we'd lost during the famine started coming back. "Ay, Papa," my mother said to my father one night, "you were looking so skinny." My father smiled. "And you, Mama, I see you're finally coming back to us." But William, I was worried that a strong wind would carry that boy away. We all laughed about it now because it was only during good times that we could talk truthfully about the bad. I might stop here and record again the second half. I think this is a pretty long chapter and I'll do it in 2 parts.